Have you ever wondered why we absolutely obsess over people who hate each other, ultimately falling in love? I mean, why does a single glare between enemies feel so much more romantic than, say, 10 love confessions? And why do stories like The Cruel Prince, Fourth Wing, or Pride and Prejudice make us so emotionally addicted?
Well, it's because this trope isn't actually about romance at all. It's really about transformation. It's about watching someone go from being a literal threat to becoming the safest place in another person's life. And psychologically speaking, that might just be one of the most powerful emotional experiences the human brain can process. Today, we're going to break down the psychology, the neuroscience, and the emotional architecture behind the enemies to lovers phenomenon, and explore exactly why we just can't stop craving it.
Part 1. The Paradox of Passion.
So, enemies to lovers has undeniably become one of the most beloved tropes in fiction, stretching from dark romance all the way to classic literature. But the real reason it works isn't magic, and it's not just romance. It's the profound psychological act of unlearning bias. See, at the beginning, both characters categorize and completely dismiss each other. Sometimes they literally want to destroy each other. But slowly, they realize they were wrong. Psychologically, we are deeply attracted to narratives where emotional certainty totally collapses into vulnerability. It's what we call ego death. It's that terrifying realization that the person you feared the most actually understands you better than anyone else ever has. And that specific emotional shift creates one of the absolute strongest forms of attachment that fiction can offer.
Moving on to Part 2, the neuroscience of tension. To truly understand why this trope feels so addictive, we have to look at what conflict actually does to the human brain. At the start of an enemies to lovers story, the brain enters what psychologists call a threat response state. The other person is unpredictable, they're dangerous, they're emotionally activating. The amygdala, which is basically the brain's alarm system, becomes hyper-focused on them, and this creates massive tension. But here's where things get really fascinating. Research actually shows that fear and attraction activate extremely similar neural systems. That's exactly why emotional intensity can so easily blur into romantic tension. This phenomenon is often connected to the famous bridge study in psychology, where people who crossed a terrifying suspension bridge were actually more likely to feel attraction afterward. Why? Because the brain completely misinterpreted that fear-induced arousal as romantic chemistry. And enemies to lovers uses this exact same mechanism. The racing heartbeat, the obsession, the hyper-awareness you're constantly thinking about the other person. The brain doesn't always distinguish between hatred and attraction as cleanly as we like to think. Because love and hate are not opposites, indifferences. Love and hate are both incredibly emotionally charged states. They both require investment, attention, passion. And that's why that belligerent tension feels so intense. The emotional energy is already there, the story just simply changes its direction. But the real psychological payoff comes later, when the brain experiences relief. Because the greatest emotional high in this dynamic isn't desire, it's safety. It's the moment when someone once perceived as dangerous becomes emotionally safe. That transformation creates a huge dopamine reward response. And that's why the confession scene here often feels way more satisfying than in other romance tropes. The brain isn't just rewarded with love, it's rewarded with resolution.
Part 3. Why earned love feels more powerful. You know, one reason we emotionally trust enemies to lovers way more than the whole love at first sight thing is because the relationship actually feels earned. In a lot of instant romance stories, love appears effortless. But psychologically, effortless love can sometimes feel unstable, mostly because the characters haven't truly seen each other yet. Enemies to lovers is entirely different. The worst parts are exposed right up front. The anger, the arrogance, the deep flaws. In real life, leading with your absolute worst traits might just get you blocked, but in fiction, it creates profound emotional security. The relationship isn't based on idealization, it's based on evaluation. This is why it often feels emotionally safer to us as readers. The characters don't fall in love with perfection, they fall in love after witnessing the ugliness. And there's something deeply comforting about that, right? It reflects a human fear that so many of us secretly carry. If people truly knew the worst parts of me, would they still stay? Enemies to lovers answers that fear with a resounding yes.
Which brings us to Part 4, the power of equality and respect.
Another huge reason this trope resonates so strongly is because enemies are usually treated as true equals, especially in stories with strong female protagonists. The enemy isn't dismissed, they're respected, they're feared, they're matched. In typical romance stories, one character is often idealized, while the other just kind of admires them. But here, both characters challenge each other, intellectually and emotionally. That's exactly why banter matters so much. Banter isn't just flirting, it's tension disguised as humor. It allows for intimacy without the terrifying emotional exposure. Every sarcastic comment becomes a form of psychological testing, and every argument basically becomes emotional foreplay.
This perfectly connects to one of the most famous psychological ideas behind this trope, a quote from Ender's Game. "In the moment when I truly understand my enemy, then in that very moment I also love him." That captures the heart of this dynamic flawlessly, because understanding destroys simplification. Once someone becomes fully human in your eyes, maintaining that hatred can become nearly impossible. Part 5. The architecture of the slow burn.
The best enemies to lovers stories follow a very strict emotional structure. If even one of these stages is skipped, the whole thing just feels hollow. Stage 1 is real enmity. We're not talking about minor annoyance here. It has to be actual conflict, different ideologies, genuine emotional friction. Stage 2 is forced proximity. The characters are completely trapped together, surviving together. Avoidance is basically impossible. Then we hit stage 3, reluctant respect. It's that precise moment one character realizes, okay, you're smarter than I thought. Respect becomes the very first bridge toward intimacy. Stage 4 is the protector shift. You know the one, the iconic "who did this to you" moment. Psychologically, this signals an emotional reclassification where the brain no longer sees the other person as a danger. Stage 5 is restraint. I could destroy you, but I won't. It's vulnerability disguised as control. And finally, stage 6, realization. It's the internal collapse of realizing I have changed, not just emotionally, but psychologically. Their very identity has shifted, and that transformation is what we all truly showed up for.
Part 6. True enemies versus fake enemies. Now, not all enemies to lovers stories are created equal, and as an audience, we can immediately feel the difference. There is a massive distinction between rivals to lovers and true enemies to lovers. Rivals simply compete with each other. Enemies actually threaten each other's worldview. That's why you'll see a lot of readers criticize these modern annoyance to lovers romances, because mere irritation just doesn't create enough emotional stakes. The payoff really only works when the characters must fundamentally unlearn who they thought the other person was. The emotional risk has to feel incredibly real.
Part 7. Let's look at some modern examples. Modern fiction constantly reinvents this trope because it taps into such universal psychological desires. Take The Hating Game, for example. It's a classic workplace rivalry completely fueled by competitive banter and deep emotional repression. The chemistry works so well because both characters are constantly observing each other, all while pretending they couldn't care less.
Then you have The Cruel Prince, which is arguably one of the best fantasy examples out there. Jude and Carden's relationship absolutely thrives on a dark mix of power imbalance, manipulation, political games, and this really reluctant fascination. They genuinely fear each other, but they respect each other, and they eventually become deeply emotionally dependent on each other. We also see high-stakes survival heavily mixed with attraction in stories like Fourth Wing, where the constant danger just intensifies the emotional attachment, making literally every interaction feel explosive. Similarly, A Court of Thorns and Roses acts as this profound transformation story beautifully disguised as a fantasy romance. The emotional shift hits so hard because the characters continuously challenge each other's core understanding of trust and identity. On a slightly lighter note, you have The Spanish Love Deception. Here, forced proximity and fake dating work together to intensify the emotional tension while very gradually revealing this deeply buried vulnerability between them. And of course, in classic literature like Pride and Prejudice, the immense tension comes from unlearning social ego and deep-seated prejudice. Elizabeth and Darcy have to fundamentally unlearn who they believed the other person was. Meanwhile, in much darker narratives like Hannibal, which is quite possibly one of the greatest intellectual enemies-to-lovers dynamics ever written, both characters see each other completely for who they are, the darkest parts included, and yet they still remain totally obsessed. Finally, Part 8. The fantasy of transformation. At its absolute core, enemies to lovers represents one of humanity's deepest, most vulnerable fantasies. It's the hope that people can actually change, that hatred is not a permanent state, that genuine understanding can overcome prejudice, that even deeply flawed, broken people can become worthy of love. And maybe that's exactly why this trope feels so incredibly cathartic for us. Because real life, unfortunately, often lacks that kind of emotional resolution. People misunderstand each other constantly. Relationships collapse long before clarity ever arrives. But Enemies to Lovers offers us a beautiful fantasy where emotional walls are eventually broken down, where someone looks at you and finally says, "I was wrong about you." And in a world that is so filled with division, misunderstanding, and emotional distance, that fantasy feels so incredibly comforting.
We don't love enemies to lovers because we enjoy toxicity. We love it because, as humans, we are endlessly fascinated by transformation, by the beautiful idea that someone can witness your absolute worst moments and still choose you, that something incredibly dangerous can become completely safe, that hatred can eventually become understanding, and maybe, just maybe, that love feels the most meaningful when it has to fight its way into existence. So maybe the real reason we love enemies to lovers so much is simply because it gives us hope that people are capable of changing. I'd love to know, what is your absolute favorite enemies to lovers story? And do you personally prefer rivals or true enemies? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love deep dives into psychology, character analysis, and the darker side of human emotion, make sure to subscribe to Psychology with Divine.